First of all, who here is doing iOS or Macintosh objective development? Those of you who are not, who's not doing it, you don't have to leave. Hopefully this talk will actually be useful for you too. I do a lot of Java development too. I find mixing the two platforms, looking at the ideas to be very useful. Now, at WWDC a couple weeks ago, they introduced some new changes. I thought we might want to talk about that. So we're going to cover Objective-C, the changes that will really be useful for both iOS and the Macintosh. First of all, I want to talk about Objective-C. It is a standard. Yes, it's driven by Apple, and commercially, the only platforms around to do it are the Mac and iOS. But it is a standard. It's very active. It has the equivalent of peer review. It has a lot of computer scientists working on it. Because of this, their changes have been coming very fast. They're very innovative, and also very much based on feedback of users out there. So for that reason, I think it's worth reviewing, even if you're doing Java or C++ Sharp or any of the other development systems. What we're not going to talk about here is ARC. Does everyone know what ARC is? Have you heard about it? It's automatic retain count. It is the hot topic at WWDC. It's going to be introduced to iOS 5. We're not going to talk about it. Go watch. They have thousands of hours of WWDC videos. My humble opinion, and this is strictly my opinion, wait for it. The tools are not quite ready there. iOS is supposed to be coming out in the fall, I believe. The version of ARC that they're releasing now has caveats all over the place that this version will not be doing it this way when they release. This is very bleeding edge stuff. However, ARC is the future. If you're familiar with the Macintosh, we have something called garbage collection, which we released recently. Garbage collection is going away. It's going to be dropped. ARC's going to be replacement, and it works on both the Macintosh for iOS 5 and Mac 10.7 and iOS 5. So if you do software that shares code between the two, this is the way to do it. Having been said, I will tell you about ARC. ARC in a nutshell is the fact that, that the retain and release is now so fast, the compiler will automatically insert these calls in the code for you, so you never have to do it. That's the whole idea behind ARC. They've realized that the retain and release on every single assignment is an efficient way of doing it. So the compiler handles it for you. That's going to reduce at least a third of my code handling something like that. Garbage collection itself was phenomenal. This is even better. So let me talk about Objective-C 1.0. This is what originally was available for the Mac OS 10.0 and also for iOS. It's basically implementation file, interface file, objects, implementation, the header files, .h, the interface file. Anyone knows why they call .m? They're method files. That was the original name. That's where the .m from. To read a bit of trivia. Here's Objective-C 1.0. Now we also have something categories. A lot of people have never seen this before until they did the Mac OS. Java is now starting to support a very similar mechanism. Other languages are too. This is a capability of actually adding calls to existing objects. Apple uses it heavily. I've used it really heavily. I override NSWindow to give calls that are very useful for me. In this instance, if you take a look closely here, let me zoom it in. Zoomed it in. You basically say, here's my object, and here are new calls I want to add to it. Here's my object, here's new implementations. They also had something I'm not sure anyone ever knew about called class extensions. It's the same thing, except there's no name here. I used to call it unnamed categories. It isn't, it's class extensions, and there's a distinct and unsubtle difference between the two, and we'll talk about it in a second. Objective-C 2.0 came out. This is review, please bear with me, okay? Properties were the most important thing of Objective-C 2.0. They recognize the fact, hey, we have instance variables that we want to access. So we're going to create synthesized calls. So it actually creates in your code, you have the line here saying, here's my property, here I want it to synthesize. It's the equivalent of creating these calls for you automatically. That looks simple, but that's a variation of abstraction and trying to get scope of, so you don't access the instance variables directly. It really became popular when you start synthesizing objects because the calls could handle the memory management. I can reduce a large amount of my retained counts by going to properties. This was the big thing for, now iOS came out with this, Mac it actually was a new change. So it was a really big thing for us then. Now, here's exactly the same thing. This is dot notation. Everyone who does iOS recognizes it. This is how we access the properties. So this is all review. Hopefully none of this is a surprise for you. Here are the property keywords. I want to review them real quick. Non-atomic, atomic, read-only, read-write, retain, and assigned. Retain and assign has to do with properties, whether or not we retain the count or whether or not we just assign it and we don't take care of the retain count. Does anyone not understand atomic and non-atomic, by the way, who uses it? Non-atomic means the code is not thread safe. All your properties will be set to non-atomic if you don't do thread, because there's significant performance if you don't assign it. So I've seen a lot of people don't set non-atomic and they're wondering why their code runs a little slow. That's the reason. Every time you make a call to a property that's not a non-atomic one, you're actually syncing it up, and that can slow you down considerably. So here's the first thing that you should do. This is one of the first changes that Apple started introducing, was they said, let's rename the instance variable. Before, you had your instance variable here, and it reflected the exact name of the property. But then they said, well, that's kind of silly, because then the guy can access it as an instant variable. You lose the idea of scope, you lose the idea of encapsulation. So they said, okay, let's change the name to something really silly, or underscore. And that told the user, you should really never access the instant variable, always do the property. That was the first change. Well, then someone said, well, if we do that, why do we need to actually have the instance variable there? So they actually changed the property, so there is no instance variable here for my integer. The call synthesize will say that the instance variable associated with that property is right there. Everyone should be doing this now. If you create your property now, this was only supported on a certain version of the Mac and a certain version of iOS, and I honestly don't remember what point it switched over. But this is the way you should be doing your code now. You should not be setting the instance variables explicitly. You should let the synthesize do it for you. Why should you do it that way? Because then the scope, you don't have the instance variable here on your public calls. Who here is in a project for more than one person and you share code? You have 2 or 3 people, you don't want them to go and look at the instant variable because you might be changing it. You want them to access the public calls. So Apple started to follow some of the computer science ideas in doing this. Now, when do you actually access the instance variable? The only reason to do it is during initialization and deallocation. There are some reasons why that's a good time to do it. The rest of the time, always use the properties to access instance variables. So now I'm bringing you up to just about to the level of WWDC. That was about the state of the art of what Apple had been telling us to do. They themselves were doing this inside their code. Oh, by the way, there's still a problem here. Instance variables that were not properties are still in the header. If I went back and showed it here, this ivar is still an instance variable that really only should be accessed in the implementation, but it had to be declared in the header. So now let's start talking about what's actually changes. Is the fact that said Apple, sorry?
I call them private variables. So the ivar was private variable. Mm-hmm. And you said that though within a single class, you should always access the public interface instead of using the private name?
Right. If you have a property and you assign it a private name for the property, the instance variable is actually the memory location, then you should not access it in other codes that use that object, and you should only access that.
But even within self?
In yourself, only during the initialization, deallocation. Okay. For example, if you say you have a my object somewhere, you should be using self.myObject everywhere in your code other than initialization and deallocation. Because let's say somewhere down, you leave a project and he gets hired, and he starts doing something, and I'm going to change, I know this code, and I'm going to change something, but you had the counter do something in the property accessor. He doesn't know that, so he changes the instance variable directly, the whole thing falls apart. Now, of course, you being a good programmer, you're going to document this, but documentation isn't always up to stuff. Hopefully that answers it a little bit. So what's the big thing that Apple introduced at WWDC was the idea that instant variables are no longer in the header. If you take a look here, there is no instance variable. Instead, they changed it so you put brackets around it, and you can define an instance variable in the implementation. So only the person who can access this is this part of your code. It was a real subtle change, and it's really useful. I find that I was doing that on myself, on my own, documenting all the information about the instance variable in the header, but I still had to find it here. This was one of the biggest changes they introduced this month. The second place you can, let me zoom in so you saw exactly how the implementation now allows you to define an instance variable right there. The other place you can do it was in the class extension. Class extension is an unnamed category that can only be created if you create the object. You cannot extend the class extension to NS objects. You can't extend the class extension to your own object. This is a way to divide the code up so that you work on the main project of the code and you work on the user interface portion of the code.